The painted reflection. Maya wiped a bead of sweat from her brow as she stepped onto the dusty porch of the old cottage. She was used to the hustle of city life, traffic humming beneath her apartment window, horns blaring at all hours, and neon signs that flickered through her blinds at night. Yet something about this secluded place in the countryside called to her, promising inspiration far from the clangor of skyscrapers and the suffocating press of the crowds. She had come here to paint in solitude, to rediscover the spark she feared was fading beneath the weight of constant commissions and the exhausting demands of the competitive art scene. The cottage was an unassuming structure, built from sturdy timber and capped with a slate-gray roof that had seen better days. Its walls bore hints of chipped paint and weathered wood that gave the impression it had been left to fend for itself against the elements for some time. Thick pine trees lined the property, their branches whispering as a gentle breeze coursed through them. The nearest neighbor, she had been told, lived half a mile away, and that suited her perfectly well. She inserted the key into the front door's lock, surprised that it turned so smoothly. Inside, she found a single large room that served as both living space and kitchen, with an attached bedroom at the back. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that slipped through the windows, revealing a place unoccupied for years. There was no electricity, just a few kerosene lamps, a gas stove, and a small fireplace. The furniture was simple: an old wooden table with a single chair, a faded armchair near the fireplace, and a cot in the bedroom. She had brought her own supplies: canvases, brushes, tubes of paint, and a large folded easel currently leaning against one wall. She would make this work. It might not be luxurious, but the promise of absolute quiet was all the luxury she needed. She opened the windows to let in the late summer air, which carried the green scent of pine and the earthiness of damp soil. She breathed deeply. This was where she would reset her life, she thought. No more deadlines, except for the ones she imposed on herself. No more demands from galleries wanting a specific theme or from clients requesting precise color palettes. Here, she would return to the source of her creativity, to paint whatever emerged from her inner world. And for her first subject, she would paint the self-portrait she'd always avoided. It seemed fitting to confront her own reflection amid the solitude. Maya set up her easel in front of the window for natural light. She carefully unwrapped a new canvas, crisp and unblemished, and placed it on the easel. With measured movements, she arranged her brushes according to size, laid out her palette, and squeezed out small dollops of paint in the order of the spectrum she typically used. Whites and yellows on the left, then the reds, then blues and greens to the right, and finally the deeper blacks and browns in a corner for shadows. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, a slight woman with a delicate face, her black hair twisted into a loose bun. There was a quiet determination in her dark eyes that she hadn't seen in herself for a while. Feeling an almost electric thrill in her chest, she began. Her brush, dipped in the faintest wash of white, sketched an outline on the canvas. She rarely did preliminary sketches in pencil. She preferred the immediacy of paint. Soft strokes formed the curve of her face, the rise of her cheekbones, the gentle slope of her eyebrows. Hours melted away, and she found herself in a trance. She barely paused for food or water, so engrossed was she in capturing not only her features, but the essence of what lay behind them. A certain vulnerability, a hint of exhaustion, and a spark of resilience. These intangible qualities found their way into each stroke. When finally she leaned back, the afternoon light had started to wane, the corners of the cottage growing darker. She blinked, as though waking from a dream. The self-portrait on the canvas was serene, her expression calm and focused. It wasn't finished. The background remained vague, the lower portion of her body just faint outlines, but it was a strong beginning. She was surprised by the sense of peace she felt looking at it. The expression in the portrait's eyes looked, she thought, like hope. She tidied up her brushes, cleaned her palette, and washed her hands in the sink. Then, lighting a kerosene lamp, she heated a simple dinner of soup on the gas stove, sitting at the little table and listening to the wind rustle against the cottage's wooden walls. After dinner, she lay down on her cot, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep. As her eyes closed, she felt the pulse of creative satisfaction, a calm she had sought for a long time. Maya's dreams were disjointed. She saw flashes of color dancing in darkness and heard distorted whispers that might have been her own voice calling to her. She woke abruptly in the middle of the night to the sound of something faint scraping against the walls, or perhaps the window. Her heart thudded in her ears, and she sat up, straining to hear more. She flicked on the lantern next to her bed and peered around the small cottage. All was quiet now, and the only movement was the flutter of curtains in the moonlight. Telling herself it was just a pine branch scratching against the window or a nocturnal creature passing by, she took a moment to catch her breath, then eventually drifted back to sleep. Morning brought with it a sliver of golden light through the cracks in the shutters. Rubbing her eyes, Maya rose, prepared some coffee on the stove, and walked over to her easel. She nearly dropped her mug. The portrait had changed. She had left it half finished, but now the face on the canvas was altered. It was still hers, but the features were askew, the jaw seeming too long, the eyes stretched wide as though in perpetual alarm, and the cheekbones looked bruised or hollowed. Brush strokes she did not remember making glistened on the surface. Dried paint indicated these were not wet additions, but ones that must have been made sometime in the night or earlier. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her mind racing with possibilities. Had she sleepwalked and painted in a trance? She couldn't recall ever doing such a thing in her entire career. Night painting was not entirely foreign to her, but sleep painting? And if so, how had her technique grown so disquieting? The contours had a feverish look, the colors swirling in unnatural shadows. Her stomach twisted at the sight. She touched the painted cheek in disbelief, her fingertips skimming the cold, thick paint. Then she let her eyes wander down to the rest of the canvas. The faint outlines she had made for her shoulders and upper torso had transformed as well. They were sharp angles now, an almost skeletal depiction. Baffled and unsettled, she spent the rest of the morning trying to fix the painting. With careful strokes, she softened the jawline, reshaped the eyes, and dabbed light tones to ease the gaunt hollows in her cheeks. By midday, the portrait looked nearly normal again, if a bit more somber than her initial version. She told herself that it might have just been the fatigue. Perhaps she had painted late, half awake, and simply forgotten. She convinced herself that it wouldn't happen again. That night, Maya resolved to stay up late to observe her painting. Just in case, she brewed a pot of strong tea and stationed herself near the fireplace, the cottage silent around her. Occasionally, she got up to stroll around, checking the windows, glancing at the portrait, and stepping outside to feel the cool night air against her face. Stars stretched overhead in a magnificent array she rarely saw in the city, but she could only focus on the flickering shapes in the corners of her vision. In the shadows of the trees, she sometimes thought she perceived a figure. Only the rustling of undergrowth and the occasional hooting of an owl accompanied her, though. By 2 in the morning, her eyes were heavy, and she was losing the battle to stay awake. She had arranged a small lamp to illuminate the easel, so she could see every inch of it. But as the minutes ticked by, her lids grew heavier, and finally she allowed herself just to rest her eyes for a moment. She awoke with a start to the kerosene lamp sputtering out. Darkness shrouded the cottage. Her neck ached from having dozed off in a chair. She scrambled to her feet, searching for the spare lamp. Outside, the moonlight provided just enough illumination for her to see her own silhouette as she fumbled with a match. With an impatient flick, she lit another lamp. The self-portrait stared back at her from the canvas. She stifled a gasp. The changes were less drastic than the previous night, but still undeniably there. The eyes, which she had repainted to be calm and softly introspective, were again wide, like 2 full moons, ringed with dark circles that hinted at bruises. A section of the painting that depicted her shoulder now showed a deep, bluish blotch. It looked like an actual bruise on painted skin. The sight sent a chill through her spine, feeling a sudden, stabbing pain in her upper arm. Maya set the lamp on the floor and rolled up her sleeve. To her horror, her flesh bore a bruise, faintly yellow and blue, the same size and shape as what she saw in the portrait. She touched it gently, and the soreness flared. Had she banged into something in her half-asleep wanderings? She couldn't recall any such incident, but the bruise existed as proof of an injury. Fear coiled in her stomach. She staggered back, gaze locked on the painting. Had she manifested something into being with her art? That notion seemed absurd, yet no rational explanation formed in her mind, and a creeping dread began to suffocate her. She hurriedly doused the painting in the dull glow of the lamp, ready to fling it to the floor in frustration. But some part of her mind, still the meticulous artist, wouldn't let her destroy her work so hastily. Instead, she turned the canvas away from her so she wouldn't have to see the contorted features glaring at her through the night. In the morning, after a restless sleep, Maya awoke feeling sore and exhausted. She shuffled to the easel, half dreading what she would find. The canvas was exactly as she had left it, bruises and all. Beneath the bright morning light, her distorted features on the painting seemed even more grotesque. Her heart hammered at the memory of the real bruise marring her arm. She couldn't dismiss it as a coincidence. She stood in front of the canvas for a long time, her coffee turning cold in her mug. If she tried to paint over it again, would it continue to change? Would she discover new bruises blooming on her flesh? She felt a rush of panic, a sense that something in this cottage defied her knowledge of art or of reality. Determined not to be a passive victim in her own life, Maya positioned a second canvas next to the first and began to paint anew. This time, she avoided self-portraiture, instead sketching the view from her window. The towering pine trees, the forest floor dotted with fallen needles and pine cones, and the beams of golden morning light cutting through the branches. She threw herself into the scene, trying to capture the ephemeral quality of dawn. By midday, she had created a peaceful woodland landscape, free from the unsettling energies coursing through her other painting. Yet, as soon as she put down her brush, her eyes slid to the self-portrait, turned around on its easel. She pulled its cloth covering back an inch, as if verifying it still existed. It did, of course, but she noticed something else now. Beneath the swirl of colors, in the background, appeared faint shapes, faces maybe. They were ghost-like, barely there, but they seemed to peer at her from behind the main figure's contorted visage. She covered it up quickly, her heart hammering. That evening, she found it impossible to concentrate on anything else. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind made her jump. She double-checked the locks on the door. With a jolt of realization, she wondered if the cottage had any history. In her rush to rent a remote space for her retreat, she hadn't probed deeply into the property's background. Perhaps it was rumored to be haunted. The rational side of her mind snorted at the idea, but she couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply wrong here. Her phone had no signal in this area, and there was no internet. Normally, that was part of the appeal, no distractions, but now it left her feeling isolated. She resolved to visit her nearest neighbor, an older couple who apparently lived half a mile down the winding dirt road, just to break the loneliness and perhaps glean some information about this cottage. The next morning, Maya set out on foot, the sun shining overhead, as if to mock her nighttime fears. She followed the narrow trail, lined with pines, until she reached a small, tidy house with a vegetable garden in front. A stout, gray-haired woman greeted her from the porch with a friendly wave. Maya introduced herself as the tenant of the old cottage and asked if she could speak with them about the area. The woman, Linda, invited her in for tea. Linda's husband, Richard, joined them at the table. He was a retired carpenter, his rough hands showing a lifetime of labor. They spoke amicably for a time. Maya complimented their well-kept garden. Linda asked about her painting. Finally, Maya summoned the courage to broach the subject of the cottage's history. Linda looked at her husband, lips pursed. Richard rubbed his chin and spoke cautiously. "Not much to tell," he said. "Been empty a few years now. People say it's too remote, too old-fashioned, needs a lot of upkeep." "Yes," Maya said. "But was there anyone who lived there before? Did anything unusual happen?" "Unusual, you say?" Linda asked, leaning forward. Maya hesitated. She didn't want to sound unhinged, so she offered a vague explanation. "I've been having strange dreams, seeing things at night. I wondered if there was any local lore or ghost story. Maybe." Richard scratched at his thinning hair. "I've heard rumors," he admitted. "Long ago, a woman lived there who was supposedly a medium or psychic. Folks said she saw spirits, painted them sometimes. But that's old gossip. Not sure how true it is. I know some renters complained about odd noises. Could be the wind or animals in the attic." Maya nodded, relieved yet unsettled. The idea of a psychic painter living in her exact spot made her skin crawl. She forced a small laugh. "I guess I'll just blame the old pipes. Anyway, thank you for the tea." Linda insisted on packing some vegetables for her, and Maya felt a grateful warmth for their kindness. Before she left, Richard put a hand gently on her shoulder. "Don't let the place get to you," he said. "It can be eerie out there alone. If you ever feel uneasy, you come to us, all right?" Maya promised she would, then made her way back through the pine-scented forest. Her conversation with the neighbors had provided no real solace. Instead, her mind conjured images of a long-dead painter, perhaps driven to madness by ghostly visions. Was she following in those footsteps? That night, a thunderstorm rumbled across the sky. Heavy rain lashed the windows, lightning illuminating the small cottage in bursts of stark white. Maya lit every lamp she had, as if chasing away the darkness could chase away her dread. She considered painting to calm herself, but she didn't dare approach that self-portrait now. Not in this electric hush before the storm's crescendo. She let it remain covered, out of sight, turned to face the wall. Instead, she tried to occupy herself by sketching quick charcoal drawings in a spiral pad. Nothing ambitious, just gestures of the cottage's interior. Her cup of tea, the storm-lashed forest, glimpsed through the window. But her hand kept wandering to grotesque shapes, and she found herself shading in hollow eyes, twisted limbs. She tore out each page as soon as she noticed it happening, crumpling and discarding them in an old wicker bin. Midway through the storm, the lamps flickered. Maya cursed under her breath. She had no electricity to worry about, but the kerosene lanterns could still be snuffed if a draft blew in from beneath the door. She stood to shut the windows more securely, but a flash of lightning drew her attention to the easel. She could see the outline of the canvas under the cloth, the ghost of her own shape. Another flash lit the covered portrait eerily. In that second of bright illumination, she thought she saw movement, as if the cloth was billowing from within. She blinked, breath catching in her throat. The cloth stilled immediately, leaving her to question her eyes. Her heart pounded, urging her to check, but she remained rooted in place. The storm raged, thunder rolling like distant cannon fire. She strained to listen, half expecting to hear the rasp of a brush on canvas or the faint moan of a specter. Instead, she heard only the wind and the relentless patter of rain. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She collapsed into her bed, arms crossed defensively over her chest, as if she could shield herself from nightmares. And nightmares indeed came. Swirling shapes, painted figures that reached out with ghostly hands. Her reflection in a mirror that melted into a grotesque grin. She tried to scream in the dream, but her voice was muffled by an unseen force. Maya jolted awake before dawn. Her sheets twisted around her legs, sweat matted her hair. Without thinking, she rushed to the easel, yanking the cloth aside. In the pale blue light filtering through the window, she saw her painting. Any hope that it had returned to normal vanished instantly. The face was even more distorted than before. The jaw sagged unnaturally, like the subject was caught mid-silent scream. and the eyes bulged in a manner that made her shiver. In the background, the ghostly faces she had noticed earlier were more defined, swirling in a dizzying pattern, and the bruise on the shoulder was now a deep purple blotch. Her breath came in ragged gulps. Tense with dread, she peeled back the collar of her nightshirt to inspect the bruise on her shoulder. It had darkened overnight, as though she had been punched. She recalled no such injury. It hurt to touch, the flesh tender and inflamed. On impulse, she grabbed the painting and dragged it to the fireplace. She would burn it, she decided, end whatever link existed between that cursed canvas and her body. Her hands shook as she tried to stoke the embers from the storm-chilled ashes. The kindling caught flame, and the fire slowly roared to life. But as she prepared to feed the painting into the flames, a sharp pain tore through her shoulder, doubling her over. She cried out, gasping. It felt as though someone had driven a hot spike into her flesh. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself to lift the canvas again, to push it forward into the flames. But the pain blossomed anew, searing up her neck and down her arm. Spots danced in her vision, and she staggered backward, whimpering. She dropped the painting onto the floor. Somehow the portrait had not even singed, despite being so close to the heat. Slumping against the rough stone of the fireplace, she stared at it, tears pricking her eyes. She realized with dawning horror that she might be physically bound to it now, that destroying the painting would destroy her as well. For the next few days, Maya tried to ignore the cursed portrait, but each night it changed again. Small shifts or large distortions that mirrored new bruises or abrasions on her body. A small scrape appeared on her thigh one morning, matched by a sliver of sickly green color on the painting's lower form. She noticed a faint rings around her neck, almost like a bruise left by a rope, only to discover the painting now bore a dark line along its throat, a shadowy band that suggested strangulation. She hardly ate, hardly slept, consumed by the slow, insidious terror of it all. She grew pale and thin, her cheeks hollowing much like the twisted face in the painting. The second canvas, the peaceful woodland scene, offered no consolation. In fact, when she peeked at it one morning, she discovered that the once vibrant greens and golds looked dull, as if drained of color. A creeping stain of gray had begun at the edges, turning the trees and sky lifeless. The sense of decay permeated everything she touched, every stroke of her brush. As the days blurred together, she realized she could not stay in the cottage much longer. Her connection to the painting felt malignant, like a parasite draining her vitality. Perhaps she could escape if she simply ran away, left the painting behind. She decided that the following morning, she would gather her things and depart for good, find a place to store them, or even discard them if necessary. She could buy new art supplies later. She stuffed her clothes into a suitcase, haphazardly gathering brushes and half-empty paint tubes. The painting remained on the easel, uncovered, a silent witness to her desperation. The face on the canvas looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. Was it mocking her, pleading with her to stay? She shook her head, refusing to linger. At sunrise, she planned to carry everything to her car. Yet as the first faint glow brightened the horizon, she discovered a new horror. Bruises stretched across her arms, her shoulders, her thighs, purple and black welts she had never noticed. Worse, she felt strangely dizzy, as if half of her was drifting. When she tried to grasp the handle of her suitcase, her hand trembled so violently she couldn't get a firm hold. A wave of weakness washed over her. She sank onto the chair, panting. Her vision doubled for a second, and in that double vision, she thought she glimpsed ghostly faces swirling around her, much like the ones in the painting's background. She closed her eyes, gulping air, trying to steady herself. Something was draining her life force, and she had a sickening certainty it was the painting. Later that afternoon, Linda and Richard grew concerned. They had expected to see Maya pass by on her way to the nearby town, or at least come by for more supplies. Several days had gone by since her last visit, and Linda had promised to give her some fresh eggs. Worried, they decided to check on her. They reached the old cottage by mid-morning. The door stood ajar, swaying in the breeze. They called her name, stepping in cautiously. The cottage was silent, but for a faint echo that seemed to resonate in the corners. Dust caught the sunlight in slow, drifting motes. Linda spotted Maya's suitcase, half-packed, lying open beside the bed. A scattering of clothes lay on the floor, as if dropped in a hurry. "Maya," Richard called again, voice trembling. No answer. They ventured farther inside. The cottage held a strange chill. A sense of absence gripped them. Maya's art supplies were strewn about. Brushes, a palette smeared with dried paint, tubes squeezed half empty. By the fireplace, a few burnt logs sat in cold ash. Linda's eyes flicked around the room and landed on the easel. There was a single painting there, uncovered. She walked toward it, drawn by a strange compulsion. Richard followed, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The painting was a self-portrait, though calling it that seemed an affront to Maya's beauty. The figure looked like Maya, only in the vaguest sense. The proportions were warped, the eyes sunken, the mouth twisted. Shadows and bruises marked the figure's skin. Around it, ghostly faces twisted in a whirlpool of dark color. It was deeply unsettling, a portrayal of torment captured on canvas. Linda let out a small gasp. She spotted something on the painting's lower edge, a final detail that made her stomach lurch. The subject's hands appeared to be reaching outward, as if trying to escape the confines of the canvas. For a moment, Linda could swear she saw the painted fingers twitch. She blinked hard. When she opened her eyes again, the image remained frozen, but her heart wouldn't stop thudding. "Where is she?" Richard whispered, scanning the room. "I don't know," Linda replied, voice trembling. She approached the painting, stepping closer. A chill prickled her arms. She reached out to touch the dried paint, but stopped herself. A primal sense of fear held her back, warning her that contact might be dangerous. They searched the tiny bedroom, the empty bathroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled. No sign of Maya, no sign that she had left a note or any explanation. Outside, the forest was quiet, except for the whisper of wind through pine needles. Finally, Richard said, "We should call the authorities." Linda nodded, stepping back from the painting. She couldn't help but feel it was watching her, malevolently. As she turned to leave, her foot bumped into a small canvas, partially hidden behind a chair. She bent to pick it up. It was the woodland scene Maya must have painted, the one with the pine trees in the early morning light. Yet the colors had faded to a dreary gray, as though life itself had been drained from the image. Linda shuddered, setting it down hastily. Before they exited, Richard paused. "Should we take the painting?" Linda stared at the ghastly portrait and felt a wave of revulsion. "We'll let the police handle it," she managed, her voice almost a whisper. Something told her that removing it would be a mistake, that it belonged here, for better or worse. They left in a hurry, the door left open to the swirl of dust inside. In the days that followed, local authorities conducted a search. No sign of Maya was found in the surrounding woods, nor on the roads leading to the village. Her car still sat in the small clearing beside the cottage, keys on the kitchen table. The police interviewed Linda and Richard, along with other villagers who rarely had seen Maya, if at all. Without phone service or any evidence of foul play, the disappearance was a mystery. The official report mentioned the bizarre painting, but attributed no concrete significance to it, though rumors spread among the locals, each more fanciful than the last. Some claimed Maya had run off into the forest, driven mad. Others whispered of a malevolent spirit in the cottage, a ghost who captured the souls of artists. The rumors were fueled by the old stories of the psychic woman who once resided there. Soon enough, the authorities sealed off the property, but no caretaker was assigned to keep watch. The cottage sat abandoned. Wind drifted through the broken shutters. Inside, that twisted portrait remained on the easel. The only difference was a new, final detail that no one noticed. Near the bottom of the canvas, partially hidden by a swirl of dark paint, was a faint shape that looked eerily like a human foot, pressed as though it were trying to step out of the painting. It bore the same bruises that had once marked Maya's body, the same lines and contours that told the story of her slow deterioration. If one stood in the silent cottage and listened closely, one might imagine hearing a faint sigh emanate from the painting, a soft, mournful sound echoing in the emptiness. Time passed, and the cottage gained a new infamy among those who relished local legends. Some said the painting was cursed, that it had stolen Maya's soul. Others spoke of how the piece changed whenever someone dared to sneak a peek through the windows, shapes shifting in the gloom. A handful of teenagers were rumored to have tested their bravery one moonless night, and they came back shaken, insisting they had heard soft weeping from inside and seen shadows move across the windows. The rumors wound their way into the small community, but no one was eager to buy or rent the cottage. It became a place of whispered warnings, especially to those who might be artistically inclined. Linda and Richard never forgot the look of the portrait, how it seemed to be reaching outward. They never forgot the sense of a presence in that house, oppressive and hungry. Some nights, when Linda felt restless, she would stand at her window that faced the woods, half expecting to see a lonely figure trudging down the dirt path, returning at last. But that figure never came. No matter how much she hoped, Maya was simply gone, leaving only a nightmarish painting to explain her fate. Even years later, occasional curiosity seekers would trek out to the dilapidated cottage. The weather-worn roof sagged, the shutters banged in the wind. Inside, paint peeled from the walls and pooled in flakes on the floor. Dust covered everything like a burial shroud. Yet the easel still stood near the fireplace, and the portrait remained. Those who dared shine a flashlight on it would see a contorted visage that barely resembled any living person. Yet the eyes compelled them, horrified eyes that spoke of entrapment. Some onlookers swore they detected a sheen, as if tears glazed the painted pupils. Most left quickly, disturbed by the uncanny realism. A handful claimed to have glimpsed new details: an outstretched arm at the painting's edge, a faint reflection of an open door behind the figure, or fresh bruises that blossomed like dark flowers across the painted flesh. A few, bold or foolhardy, considered taking the painting as a trophy of their bravado. But an inexplicable stabbing fear always stopped them. It was as if the painting itself warned them away, vibrating with malice in the stale air of the ruined cottage. Thus, the painted reflection, as it came to be known, stayed in that lonely place, an eerie testament to Maya's disappearance. Over time, the story mingled with local folklore. Some claimed the original occupant's spirit guided Maya's hand, or that the painting was a conduit to another realm. Others simply believed Maya succumbed to madness and fled into the forest, though no evidence supported that. Yet, over and over, the rumor circulated that one could still see Maya in that painting, trapped behind every swirl of color, screaming for release. In a final epilogue, a traveling journalist heard the tale and, consumed with morbid curiosity, decided to investigate. She managed to find the old cottage, pushing aside dangling branches and stepping over fallen logs. Evening shadows stretched across the ground by the time she arrived, and a hush enveloped the clearing. The front door, long since splintered, hung crooked on its hinges. She stepped inside, heart pounding. The stale smell of rot invaded her nostrils. Her flashlight beam scanned the sparse interior, falling on the dusty table, the battered chair, the moldy remnants of a cot in the bedroom. And then it fell upon the painting. Her breath caught at the sight. She had read rumors, but the intensity of its horror struck her like a physical blow. The swirling background looked almost alive, the ghostly faces forming a vortex that seemed to move beneath the beam of her flashlight. The central figure was a wraith-like version of Maya, or so the stories claimed. with bruised skin and hollow eyes. One hand reached outward, the fingertips only a hair's breadth from the painting's edge. In the hush of the abandoned cottage, the journalist could almost hear a heartbeat, or perhaps it was her own pulse racing in her ears. She stepped closer, her flashlight trembling. She had intended to photograph it, proof, perhaps, to accompany her story. But as she raised her camera, she felt an unnatural chill crawl up her spine. The lens fogged, and an unexpected surge of anxiety paralyzed her. An uncanny presence radiated from the canvas, a terrible gravity that pulled her closer. It was as if the figure on the canvas locked eyes with her, pleading for something she could not give. Her courage broke. She staggered back, turned, and ran out into the night, never taking the photograph, never finishing her investigative piece. Instead, she fled the countryside and returned to the city, haunted by the painting's phantom stare. No article was ever published, save for a short mention in her personal blog, a cryptic paragraph about an artist's reflection that devoured her soul. And so the cottage remained forsaken, its solitary occupant neither living nor dead, existing forever on that cursed canvas. Maya had vanished, her body never found, her presence erased, except for the chilling portrait that bore her name in the corner. It was a faint signature, scrawled in dried paint, Maya Rowe, a silent cry for remembrance, an echo of her once brilliant artistic gift, and now a perpetual testament to the darkness that had claimed her. In the end, the only lesson gleaned from the tragedy was a cautionary whisper. Some reflections are best left unpainted. For once, such darkness finds a way onto the canvas. It may be that the very essence of the artist becomes trapped, absorbed into a world of shadows and contortions from which there is no return.